submitted your answers, I will just reply to the post and I'll put your grade here. And in looking at the submissions, I think people will do quite well. All of the answers seem to be very organized. The grades are often high in undergraduate classes as long as people attend and complete their work. The grades are usually quite good. It's sometimes the last year of undergrad is more competitive and the assignments become more difficult. When you apply, if you decide to apply for law school or grad school, they will usually look at the last year of your transcript more than others. So this is why sometimes the last year is made more competitive by the university because it will be the final year that is looked at. Like if you were to write the Canadian LSAT exam and then if you were to then go to law school, it will look at your whole transcript, but they will specifically focus on the last year. So that if your grades are, say, average in the first 2 years and then the last year your grades are very good, you will probably still be accepted and you will probably still get funding from the government. So the funding programs for graduate schools are the Ontario Graduate Scholarship Program, which is a master's program. And any students in Ontario who are accepted to do a master's can apply for OGS. So OGS is the Ontario Graduate Scholarship Program, and it's available to any students who are accepted into a master's program in Ontario, and I believe that you must be a permanent resident or citizen of Canada. Check. I'm not sure if the rules have changed. When I was applying, it's changed. Yeah, I think if you're accepted, you can be eligible now. That's good. So this is what the University of Ottawa says. It's good. So that's OGS, and you are also, if you are accepted to a Canadian PhD program, you are eligible for SHRC, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council Scholarship. So this is also true of law schools as well. You'd be eligible for funding. So if you're interested, you could think about it next year, I guess, when you're the final year of your program. You should then, I guess, think about it and also think about the application process. You have to write a proposal and then you can be accepted. This is also true of law school, and you have to write the LSAT as well. I would consider it. There will always be teaching work. It's also about your own kind of ambition with these things that you can, if when people are really ambitious, usually with their careers, then they can definitely find full-time positions, especially if they're willing to move throughout different parts of Canada or the world. Um, so there is a lot of scholarship funding, and there are a lot of jobs, but I mean, it would have to be something that you would seek out on your own because of your own interests and ambitions. If you're interested in Alberta, I previously taught in the Gender Studies program at the University of Lethbridge, and I taught online as well. And they have a really interesting Gender Studies program. It's the Department of Women and Gender Studies at University of Lethbridge, and it's a very strong program that encourages advocacy and activism. So the topics that we have been discussing in Indigenous issues would definitely be of interest in this class if you are interested in further graduate studies in Alberta. I'm familiar with this program. There are lots of programs that would focus on Indigenous issues, specifically gender studies and also sociology and political science as well. That's good. Yes, I taught at the University of Lethbridge online. They have a lot of really interesting programs. If you're interested, the study of religion is also really popular now. McMaster University. I have a colleague at McMaster who is now tenured, and his work is about religion. And um, you can study different religious texts and different religious faiths as well. So you could study Indigenous um, religion and philosophy in detail. McMaster has a program in Judaism and Jewish studies. I have another friend and colleague whose work is about the practice of Islam and specifically in post-war contexts. And so, like in places like Palestine and throughout the world in context of war, their work is about religion after and during war. So it would be an interesting program to think about now, specifically in this time period, and in relation to Indigenous studies, as well as Christianity and Catholicism in Canada. So I'll begin the lecture about necropolitics. Shili Memembe is a South African scholar, and Um, so Joseph Ashili Memembe is Cameroonian, and he's a research professor in history and politics at Witt's Institute for Social and Economy Research at the University of Witwatersrand. He is well known for his writings on colonialism and its consequences, and is a leading figure in New Wave French critical theory. So, Amembe writes that this essay assumes that the ultimate expression of sovereignty resides to a large degree in the power and capacity to dictate who may live and who must die. So, Memembe is interested in the ways that sovereignty and state power involves this right to decide who lives and who dies. And this is true in context of ethnic cleansing, where an ethnic or religious majority can often decide that an ethnic or religious minority will be killed or will be exiled. So Memembe draws upon Michel Foucault's concept of biopower. One could summarize in the above terms what Michel Foucault meant by biopower, that domain of life over which power has taken control. But under what practical conditions is the right to kill, to allow to live, or to expose to death exercised? Who is the subject of this right? What does the implementation of such a right tell us about the person who is thus put to death, and about the relation of enmity that sets that person against his or her murderer? So this question of the right to kill is something that is central, and it's also interesting if you were going to pursue graduate studies in religion. The right to kill is obviously something that exists now in the modern period, and it exists often because of the criminal justice system. And it exists even because of capitalism. I mean, the possibility that someone like George Floyd could be killed by police because he had counterfeit currency is really a modern idea. It is why it kind of scares postmodern thinkers as much as it does scare people whose work looks at ideas before the modern world. That the fact that someone could kill is perhaps worse than the idea of salvation. This is also true of people who have addiction issues. So we began the class by looking at the murder of Cindy Gladue, who could have had addiction issues and could have, yes, been engaged in sex work. But the fact that she died and was murdered by Bradley Barton, who was initially acquitted because she was referred to as, quote, a native prostitute, and her addiction issues were used against her in a court of law, is a modern idea. I mean, if we were to think about religion and the idea of salvation or conversion, that isn't really the same as penalizing someone to the point that they would be killed. This is also true of attitudes towards the mentally unwell in cities like Toronto, which have high rates of policing of people who are deemed to be mentally unwell. If you were to go to, say, India, like I've done a lot of research in India, then the mentally unwell in a different time period when the economy was actually not improving were not necessarily people who would be policed. But as the economy has improved and India is a more capitalist country, people who have mental health issues, including people who might be deemed to be harassatory towards, say, women, or people who uh, need attention in public, are often policed, and the police are used because the public sphere is used to buy and sell. So if you're going to go into the public sphere and buy and sell, then the last thing that you want is for someone who has mental health issues, who is lonely, who needs some sort of care to bother your customers. So the police can be used. A lot of postmodern thinking actually connects to what would be, say, pre-modern philosophy, because many postmodern thinkers would think that we are not all the same, like how you identify in terms of your gender, how you express yourself in public, your even self-expression could be a really postmodern life. I mean, there are people who do, say, performance art in public, and they might be seen to be an annoyance to the public, but it is kind of like not necessary that someone is living a life of mechanization. So when you think about mechanization, what it means is that, I mean, what Foucault would argue is that we're all really mechanized people. So I wake up at this time and so do you. We work a 9 to 5 job. We then get married at certain ages. We have children at certain ages, and we work and we die. And if there's anyone who seems abnormal, then we police them and we call the police. But what postmodernism and a lot of queer theory and feminist theory and uh, critical art practices would say is that we don't really all have to live this life. And we can't force people under law to live this life. If people don't fall in love, they don't. And if they feel as though they're being forced or abused by someone, they don't have to live this life. They can follow their own path. Activism is a good example. If someone feels as though they really feel propelled to do something to help alleviate starvation in the world, they can do this with their life. And there are many people who uh, will remember that they tried to help others, even if they might be deemed to be misguided in their efforts to help, say, starvation or to help try to alleviate starvation in India or in another country. Many people might think that they're misguided and it's a bad idea. It's a huge waste of time and there's so much corruption, but it is their life. And a lot of postmodern thinking would think about identity as not being something that can be really mechanized or policed. This is also true of religion. When people are religious, or in a different time when people were more religious, the idea of being, say, a saint or someone who would devote your life to a cause was not something that would be thought of as being a horrible decision or a decision of someone who should go to therapy until they buy a suburban home and marry and have children. Like this is also about how we view someone's life. And it is about this domain of life that if someone really has strong beliefs in wanting to impart goodness towards others, they can. And it doesn't just have to be the goodness of a family, although that could exist. But I mean, it is still possible to meet people in countries, especially rural religious places, who devote a significant part of their lives to trying to aid the poor and trying to stop things like starvation. And people do this because they genuinely believe that um, God does not want people to starve or to experience suffering simply because they were born into a family that does not have a lot of material wealth. So this kind of idea of modernism and the modern state and the state's right to kill, and also the state's right to incarcerate and to police, is also about poverty. And one of the most obvious forms of biopower and biopolitics and also necropolitics today is the possibility of making somebody so poor that they could die. And so because you don't have enough capital, could you actually die because you are incapable of finding a job? And the unfortunate truth is, because of housing scarcity in this time period, it is possible that people could actually die because they cannot find a job. And in the other class I teach, I'm teaching a book by Robert Brim, and it's a sociology textbook that looks at, and a significant part of Brim's text, which is an introductory book, just looks at statistics about poverty in Canada. And it is possible, especially in big cities like Toronto and Vancouver, that if you cannot sell your labor, that you could become precariously housed, and then you could potentially die. And this is also true because of cold weather. There is obviously a shelter system. Toronto has a very good shelter system, and people work to provide others housing throughout the whole course of their lives. And I know lots of people who work in certain care industries, like if you were to get a master's degree in social work, you can spend, you can't have a career that is just about working with people who are poor and precariously housed, or who have a lot of issues, specifically with housing security, because housing is so expensive. You can work in these industries, but the point is that I guess the question is, how is it possible that someone dies because they're poor? And what decisions has the state made that have allowed us to value money and capital to the point that it is the reason that people stay alive? And this is about modern biopower. So in the time Michel Foucault was writing about the state's right to kill, it was really about like he wrote in the 19th century in France, and his sense that people could be killed by the state was also about his worry about mental health issues and what Foucault termed madness. So Michel Foucault was gay, and he was really concerned that people who were gay could be termed mad and could be killed by the state. In this time period, I would argue that it is unlikely that someone who is gay could be killed by the state, but it is possible that someone who is poor could be deemed to be quote unquote insane or mad, and they could be policed and they could be killed by the state. Andrew Loku was a Sudanese refugee who lived in a house or an apartment that was owned by the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. And he was given this apartment, but he was also monitored, and he also had severe mental health issues. So on the night that he was murdered by police, he was making a great deal of noise, and he was being extremely loud, and someone called the police. And so when the police went to Andrew Loku's home, he was holding a hammer in his hand, and he was scared of the police. And the police tried to arrest him, and I guess there was this altercation between Loku and the police, and he was killed by the police. So Andrew Loku did suffer from mental health issues after surviving a civil war in Sudan, and he was killed by police. So the use of the clinic and the use of the police is now much more likely to affect the poor than it is to affect people who are gay, or people who are lesbian or transgender, or women who don't have traditional lifestyles. In the time that Foucault wrote, the state was often used to police those who did not use their bodies to have children at a certain age. And it was connected to, say, the Catholic Church and the state. I would argue that we have entered a time where capitalism is really the order in which we all live. And if you have enough money, I think it is possible to avoid being policed. So if Andrew Loku had lived in a different house, a suburban house, the possibility that his neighbors would hear him is actually much lower. It is about capital, because I mean, there are times when people live in, say, a large home, and they don't live so close to their neighbors. So even if he was making noise, he would not have been heard. This is why a lot of people who are middle class and affluent do not necessarily want to live in a city. And it's also why the avoidance of policing, I think, is a question of class. So One could summarize in the above term, writes Memembe, what Michel Foucault meant by biopower, that domain of life over which power has taken control. But under what practical conditions is the right to kill, to allow to live, or to expose to death exercised? Who is the subject of this right? What does the implementation of such a right tell us about the person who is thus put to death, and about the relation of enmity that sets the person against his or her murderer? Is the notion of biopower sufficient to account for the contemporary ways in which the political, under the guise of war, of resistance, or of a fight against terror, makes the murder of the enmity its primary and absolute objective? War, after all, is as much a means of achieving sovereignty as a way of exercising the right to kill. Imagining politics as a form of war, we must ask what place is given to life, death, and the human body, in particular the wounded or slain body. How are they inscribed in the order of power? So Memembe understands that politics is war, and what the author is interested in arguing is that state power always engages in what could be termed warfare against different populations of people who could be killed by the state in order to further the interests of whatever program the state is engaged in. So if the state is engaged in a program of religious, uh, what would be termed a theocracy, a theocratic program, then trying to control religious minorities and also trying to ensure that people will have religious marriages and children is one of the programs that the state will undertake. If one lives as we do in a capitalist context in a time of capitalism, then the state is actively engaged in a project of nation building that involves policing the poor and involves constantly trying to get people to spend money and to also sell their labor. So Memembe is interested in totalitarianism and the ways that when the state takes its power to extremes, it could persecute an ethnic minority to the point that sovereign power or state power could be referred to as being fascist. So there have been lots of debates in the media about the US elections, and there were debates in the previous elections as well, and the debates regarding race and religion and the family uh, are really interesting because they are about life and about the state's power to govern certain lives, but also to invest in certain forms of life as opposed to others. So Memembe writes, as is well known, the concept of the state of exception has been often discussed in relation to Nazism, totalitarianism, and the concentration and extermination camps. The death camps in particular have been interpreted variously as the central metaphor for sovereign and destructive violence and as the ultimate sign of the absolute power of the negative. Says Hannah Arendt, there are no parallels to the life in the concentration camps. Its horror can never be fully embraced by the imagination for the very reason that it stands outside of life and death. Because its inhabitants are divested of political status and reduced to bare life, the camp is, for Giorgio Agamben, the place in which the most absolute conditiono in humano ever to appear on earth was realized. So this kind of totalitarianism is the problem with biopolitics and the state's investment in life. What scares Foucault is that if one does not have, say, a cisgender heterosexual marriage and have children, then can they be deemed to be, say, criminal Or can they be deemed to be unproductive? Or can they be even deemed to be mad and then institutionalized and imprisoned? And in the time that Foucault wrote, this was possible. It is still possible that in many theocratic orders, people who are gay or lesbian or transgender could be jailed, they could be persecuted, and they could be killed. And so what interests Memembe is fascism. And what Memembe wants to consider is a context in which the state is actively invested in the lives of one ethnic group or one religious group as opposed to another. And the Holocaust is obviously the most obvious and most extreme example of what happens when a state can invest in the lives of an ethnic majority and can invest in the future of a country without ethnic minorities or without people who don't abide by certain religious rules or codes. So Giorgio Agamben is a well-cited theorist who also writes about what Agamben terms bare life. And the concept of bare life is one that I discussed in the very first lecture regarding Cindy Gladue, drawing on Shireen Razak's article in which she makes reference to Agamben's writing. So for Agamben, the state, which is a sovereign power, constructs populations that it can essentially do away with. And the examples that Agamben and other political theorists like Spinoza also have discussed are from the time of the aristocracy. So in the time of the aristocracy, there was a king, and a king could kind of grant someone the right to stay in the kingdom, but they could also banish people, and they could also kill. So what interests Agamben is looking at this concept of the sovereign state and their right to do away with life in relation to non-status migrants and refugees. So is it possible that a national government can sentence people to die because they are persecuted minorities who will die in conflicts? And can they then grant certain people refugee status and not others? And the answer is yes. And Agamben has written extensively about citizenship and refugees, and Agamben wrote an article called We Refugees, making reference to Hannah Arendt. And Hannah Arendt is a German Jewish intellectual who wrote an essay called We Refugees. And in it, Arendt discusses being a refugee after the Holocaust and the condition of being stateless as being a foundational experience in her life and in the life of persecuted minorities. And Agamben is interested in whether this condition of bare life can be produced by a modern state. And I would argue that the answer is obviously yes, because of the exile of people who are not granted asylum status, and because of the capacity of the state to turn away people who will die in conflict zones, but who do not have the proper paperwork to stay in another country. So according to Giorgio Agamben, the state of law acquires a permanent spatial arrangement that remains continually out. According to Giorgio Agamben, the state of exception acquires a permanent spatial arrangement that remains continually outside the normal state of law. So Memembe draws on Agamben then to again discuss this idea of the necropolitical. So whereas Foucault was interested in the state's investment in, say, the Catholic, heterosexual, white, middle-class family, Agamben is interested in how the state then actively does not care for certain populations of people and divests from certain populations, thus producing necropolitics. And so, drawing on again, Mbembe is interested in how someone becomes outside, or how a population exists outside of the normal state of law. And it is similar to Shireen Razak's understanding of legal gray zones. So Razak argues then that legal gray zones are created in which missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls' lives are not necessarily um, given care from the state. And this is also true of instances of policing. So in the murder of Neil Stonechild and Starlight Tours, the police does not exist to protect Stonechild as a citizen and as a young person. The police actually actively seek out people like Neil Stonechild and then kill Neil Stonechild. So, how does someone then exist outside of the state of law where they are not someone who is helped by the state? They are not helped by Canada's institutions. They are actually killed by Canada's institutions. And this is also true of the sterilization of Indigenous women. How is it possible that someone does not rely on these institutions to care for them, but they actually are policed by them? And for Mbembe and other people who are other scholars who are critical of colonialism and racism, the reason is obviously because of colonialism and because of racism. So Mbembe states that the aim of his work is not to debate the singularity of the extermination of Jews or to hold it up by way of example. And so Mbembe is not just writing specifically about the Holocaust, although he does make reference to it throughout his work. As he writes, I start from the idea that modernity was at the origin of multiple concepts of sovereignty and therefore of the biopolitical. Regarding this multiplicity, late modern political criticism has unfortunately privileged normative theories of democracy and has made the concept of reason one of the most important elements of both the project of modernity and the topos of sovereignty. So, Mbembe is interested in the ways that we take rationality for granted. We assume that people will do their jobs rationally. We assume that democracy will work and that people will elect rational leaders who will behave in fair and equitable and normal ways towards the public. We don't necessarily assume that people are racist or that an entire government that is elected could have a specific set of, say, extreme ideas against a religious minority or against immigrants or against the Indigenous peoples of Canada. So from this perspective, the ultimate expression of sovereignty is the production of general norms by a body, the demos, made up of free and equal men and women. These men and women are posited as full subjects, capable of self-understanding, self-consciousness, and also self-representation. Politics, therefore, is defined as twofold: a project of autonomy and the achieving of agreement among a collectivity through communication and recognition. Thus, we are told is what differentiates it from war. So Mbembe argues that we often assume that everyone is rational. We assume that the people who live in a city are all rational people who are taking care of themselves and their family members and who are actively contributing to society. We then assume that the police are also rational and we will all do business and go ahead rationally, and we are not living in context of war. The problem is for Mbembe that sovereignty itself is a certain romance that rests on the belief that the subject is the master of their own fate and that we are all really engaged in rational decision making. So the idea of, say, a sovereign power democracy is that we all make sensible decisions. People will vote in the election, and the people that they vote for will make good decisions for all of us. They will elect good heads of policing, and people will do their jobs fairly. They will support economic growth, and they will support fairness. And what we then assume is that the people who live under democracy will follow the rule of law. Unfortunately, this is not always the case. And so, what interests Achille Mbembe, who often has written about cases of genocide and war in African nations, is when the figures of sovereignty are not those who care for us all. And over generations, if ethnic minorities or religious minorities are not cared for by the state, if they are not treated fairly in the educational system, as in the case of Canada's forced schooling of Indigenous peoples, then what happens over generations? The Canadian residential schooling system is an example of this kind of sovereign power that the Canadian state took over Indigenous people's lives. And the molestation of Indigenous children by priests and by teachers and by Canadian missionaries has been well documented in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. So this kind of destruction of populations is what interests Achille Mbembe, and why Mbembe is interested in the ways that this kind of imagined rationality is not really a true reflection of state governance. So Mbembe writes, "My concern is those figures of sovereignty whose central project is not the struggle for autonomy, but the generalized instrumentalization of human existence and the material destruction of human bodies and populations. Such figures of sovereignty are far from a piece of prodigious insanity, or an expression of a rupture between the impulses and interests of the body and those of the mind. Indeed, they, like the death camps, are what constitute the nomos of the political space in which we still live." So what is central to Mbembe, and it's quite pessimistic, but I mean, it's also not, it's not really pessimistic, it is just an argument about state power, is that in order for the state to invest in, say, our lives as settlers, there must be this remainder. I mean, even from the perspective of economics, if you're going to invest a certain amount of money into pipelines, then you are not going to invest it into the preservation of ancestral lands. And so this is an economic decision. It is also a decision about nation building. And it is also sometimes clearly or implicitly uh, a decision that national leaders often make to privilege an ethnic or religious majority. And this is true throughout the world. The problem that Mbembe has is that what this means is that sovereign power can invest in successful majorities and also then persecute minorities. So Mbembe writes, "Furthermore, the contemporary experiences of human destruction suggest that it is possible to develop a reading of politics, sovereignty, and this subject different from the one we inherited from the philosophical discourse of modernity. Instead of considering reason as the truth of the subject, we can look to other foundational categories that are less abstract and more tactile, such as life and death. So rather than thinking that we all behave in rational ways towards each other, and that we actually behave as modern people, Mbembe is interested in thinking about life and death, Do we actively support the lives of some and not others? Do we unwittingly or clearly will other people to die by ignoring their poverty or their suffering? And if not, as a people, do we then have the capacity to elect leadership and political leadership that will help the poor or help minorities? If we cannot elect national governments that care about Indigenous peoples, then what can be done? So, from a philosophical perspective, Achille Mbembe is interested in what makes us human and whether or not we can be human without being humane. In other words, writes Mbembe, the human being truly becomes a subject that is separated from the animal in the struggle and the work through which he or she confronts death, understood as the violence of negativity. It is through this confrontation with death that he or she is cast into the incessant movement of history. Becoming subject therefore supposes upholding the work of death. To uphold the work of death is precisely how Hegel defines the spirit, how Hegel defines the life of the spirit. So this struggle between life and death is also about nation building, and it is about how we understand our lives as being connected to those who are more precarious to us. I would argue the struggle for life and death is also about things like childbirth and who can and cannot give birth to children. The life of the spirit, he says, is not that life which is frightened of death and spares self-destruction, but that life which assumes death and lives with it. Spirit attains its truth only by finding itself in absolute dismemberment. So this idea of life and death interests Mbembe as an African scholar, particularly because of the relationship between life, death, and colonialism. So what Mbembe and other post-colonial scholars have discussed is this self-other binary that existed during the time of colonial rule. The killing of persons or enslaving of others in order to further European capitalist expansion is a central facet of colonial rule. The killing of indigenous peoples in the residential school system was actually quite common. And so the killing even of children, the extreme abuse of children, the spreading of smallpox, all of these acts of killing of indigenous people also support the life of settlers. So finally, Achille Mbembe draws upon Bataille and Hegel. And Mbembe is interested in the ways that this kind of life and death, or this question of life and death, is central to the constitution of modern subjectivity. So, is it possible to be part of a nation and not be implicitly or explicitly engaged in the devaluation or neglect of certain people's lives within the state or outside of it? A good example of what I mean is non-status migrants. So can you be a citizen without also supporting an idea of citizenship that excludes those who do not have a certain passport? Can you participate in institutions without upholding these norms of citizenship? Settler colonialism is the most obvious one. As settlers, are we always implicated in the ongoing genocide of Canada's Indigenous people? Even if we don't actively support these policies, as people who engage in modern capitalism, who want more development, who want more jobs and money for ourselves, are we implicitly supporting settler colonialism and genocide? So Achille Mbembe draws on George Bataille, and Mbembe is interested in life, death, and sovereignty, and the relationship between our lives as people who are part of sovereign nations and the death of, say, other people in other countries, or the death of, say, persecuted minorities within a country. Um, So we could think about this just in relation to capitalism, that if we support, say, if you live in the city of Toronto, uh, it is a really expensive place to live, but there is a lot of consumerism and a lot of industry. So when there are forest fires in other parts of Canada, you will meet people who come to Toronto and and they specifically cannot work or live in other rural parts of Canada. So the kind of life that consumer driven people and often middle class people in Toronto live is supported by this kind of environmental degradation in other parts of Canada. So if you think about it, I mean, in order to support, say, capitalist growth in one country or even one province or state, are you actively kind of stealing labor from other people? Are you ignoring all of the environmental degradation in other parts of even the same country in order to support your own economy? In very practical capitalist ways, if something does improve one's quality of living in a capitalist place or in a place that it's driven by, say, capitalism, then one will benefit from people who must sell their labor and who really need jobs. So, this kind of investment in certain lives and ignorance or neglect of others is obviously a part of modern capitalism and the modern state. So Memembe writes, first he interprets death and sovereignty as the paroxysm of exchange and superabundance, or to use his own terminology, excess. For Bataille, life is defective only when death has taken it hostage. Life itself exists only in burst and in exchange with death. He argues that death is the putrefaction of life, the stench that is at once the source and the repulsive condition of life. Therefore, although it destroys was to be, what what was to be, obliterates what was supposed to continue being, and reduces to nothing the individual who takes it, death does not come down to the pure annihilation of being. So, as a philosopher, Achille Mbembe is interested in the relationship between life and death. And Mbembe is interested in the ways that life only really exists in relation to death. Um, and one can think about this in relation to uh, the examples and the narratives that we've discussed regarding Indigenous peoples in Canada. That this kind of reduction of Indigenous peoples to bare life um, is often normalized because of racism. And so, can settler colonialism or can the lives of settlers ever exist without this casualization of the life of a persecuted ethnic minority? And I would argue throughout the world, many people who are very privileged um, have a high quality of living because of the persecution of ethnic minorities and religious minorities. This doesn't mean that people are actively um, involved in hurting others or that they are morally responsible or legally responsible, but the class structure works in a certain way so that if you are privileged in certain ways, someone is not. The housing crisis is an obvious example that when someone has housing or can afford expensive housing, others cannot. And so if you can't afford to buy very, very expensive housing, then you are in many ways contributing to the suffering of, say, people who are working class or poor who could never afford that kind of housing. Sex work is also a really interesting example. Cindy Gladue was murdered, and she was engaged, or she is argued that she could have been engaged in high-risk sex work, which is why she was exposed to Bradley Barton, who did murder her, and he murdered her in a really brutal way that involved sexual violence. So sex work is really, from a philosophical perspective, interesting because it really encompasses this relationship between life and and also death. The desire to kind of engage in high risk sex work and also to use addictive substances is also about a kind of experience of life. The use of the body and of addictive substances, of time, as something that will involve this kind of experience, but does not lead to obviously sustainability or care about life itself or about prolonging life. So Bataille firmly anchors death in the realm of absolute expenditure, the other characteristic of sovereignty, whereas Hegel tries to keep death within the economy of absolute knowledge and meaning. Life beyond utility, says Bataille, is the domain of sovereignty. This being the case, death is therefore the point at which destruction, suppression, and sacrifice constitute so irreversible and radical an expenditure without reserve, that they can no longer be determined as negativity. Death is therefore the very principle of excess and anti-economy. Hence the metaphor of luxury and the luxurious character of death. So many feminist scholars and many advocates for working class people and poor people do support the decriminalization of sex work. The decriminalization of sex work is a really controversial idea, but there have been several interesting scholarly articles and books written about efforts to decriminalize sex work from the perspective of human rights, harm reduction, um, a reduction in the spread of HIV and AIDS among sex workers, and also a reduction in the murder of sex workers. So this kind of anti-economy of death is really about the construction, or can be thought of in relation to the construction of populations of people who are made to be illegal or whose labor is deemed to be illegal or undocumented and who can therefore die. And in many cases of sex work and sex workers who die, a lot of the sex workers who are most likely to be harmed or to be brutalized or to be murdered or to contract HIV or AIDS are Indigenous women and also migrant women and lower income women of color and transgender women and non-binary people. So all of these groups of people are most likely to experience harm to the point of death. And this kind of anti-economy is then about a valuation of life that requires ignoring the reality of poor people's lives. It is similar to addiction that, unfortunately, like what often happens in any country is that people want to look at the affluent majority, or they want to look at people whose, when I say want to look at, I mean they want to kind of discuss or create programs or create media that focuses on the most privileged people who marry at a certain time, who have a religious family, who are middle class. But there are entire groups of people within any city or country who are engaged in economies that mean their lives are close or could be made precarious to the point of death. So Bataille establishes a correlation among death, sovereignty, and sexuality. Sexuality is inextricably linked to violence and to the dissolution of the boundaries of the body and self by way of orgastic and excremental impulses. As such, sexuality concerns two major forms of polarized human impulses, excretion and appropriation, as well as the regime of the taboos surrounding them. The truth of sex and its deadly attributes reside in the experience of loss of the boundaries separating reality, events, and fantasized objects. So, this kind of anxiety about sex or aversion to discussing sex is connected to colonial history and to the property owning family, which would often uh, transfer inheritance from one generation to the next. The problem is that those outside the family might be exposed or might engage in labor that is not the labor of the affluent, like sex work or the sale of drugs. And these economies then mean that it is often people who are poor and working class whose bodies are exposed to death. So I'll finish by discussing the politics of death. So throughout the class thus far, we've talked about several cases in which Indigenous people unfortunately have died or been killed at a young age, like the murder of Neil Stonechild and the murder of Cindy Gladue. There are also very high rates of suicide among Indigenous peoples, and particularly young Indigenous peoples. While there are obviously also, one can turn to other statistics, specifically in certain geographies. So Attawapiskat is a place that was in the Canadian media because of suicide. And in 2017, there was a lot of media in Canada about a suicide epidemic. And there are many really rural places like the Attawapiskat First Nation on remote James Bay, where there have been many, many suicide attempts made by Indigenous peoples. So in April, it was actually in 2016 when there were lots of news stories about a suicide crisis in the remote Canadian First Nations reserve of Attawapiskat, Ontario. And for a brief time, there was international media in The Guardian in the UK and in the New York Times. Media outlets from around the globe reported on the story of hundreds of suicide attempts in a town of under 2,000 people. The numbers were shocking and painted a picture of a town on the brink of disaster. The events in Attawapiskat, while devastating, are sadly not isolated. They are part of a greater struggle for all First Nations communities in Canada that sees them suffer a suicide rate significantly higher than their non-Aboriginal counterparts. According to a 2000 report from the Canadian Institute of Health, suicide among First Nations youth, aged 15 to 24, was about 5 to 6 times higher than non-Aboriginal youth in Canada. Attawapiskat itself has dealt with suicide among its residents long before this recent state of emergency was announced. To better understand the events of Attawapiskat, it is important to consider the recent crisis in the greater context of the ongoing impacts of colonial policies instituted by the Canadian government and the Ministry of Indian Affairs, now known as the Ministry of Indigenous and Northern Affairs. The legacy of the residential school system, the soft saw young First Nations children removed from their families and communities and subjected to horrific abuses remains the foundation for the dysfunction prevalent in many Indigenous communities. The goal of the residential school system was to isolate children from the influence of their traditions, therefore assimilating them to mainstream Canadian culture. The same policies that led to the abuse, sickness, and premature death of so many children continues to haunt communities like Attawapiskat. So the study, I mean, if we discussed religion, and religion is interesting in Canada, but I don't believe in God, and I'm not at all religious, and I do think that religion has been used as an alibi to rape and kill many Indigenous peoples, including Indigenous children. Run by the Catholic Church, the St. Anne's residential school in Fort Albany, Ontario, where children from Attawapiskat and neighboring communities were sent, um, was the site of some of the worst cases of abuse and neglect in the country. And so I would argue that there's a direct correlation between the sexual molestation of Indigenous children by Catholic and Christian priests in Attawapiskat and the suicide of Indigenous peoples. India is not a Christian country, it is a Hindu country, and many people, the Indian Mutiny of 1857 involved one of the greatest killings of Europeans in the entire history of the world. And Indian people killed Europeans, specifically Christians and Catholics, en masse in order to gain freedom from Christian rule. So India has now become an aggressively Hindu country, and I would argue that this kind of religious fundamentalism among Hindus is a form of cultural nationalism because of the history of forced Christianization. This kind of response to colonialism, which involved extreme forms of nationalism, including religious fundamentalism, is something that post-colonial scholars discuss in great detail. So Frantz Fanon wrote an essay called Algeria Unveiled. And what Fanon wrote is that Algerian women often started veiling and became devoutly Muslim to avoid forced Christianization. And Christianization for people who are under colonial rule did not really involve becoming Christians or Catholics in ways that was at all, I guess, nice. The rates of rape, sexual abuse, the taking of wives outside of one's marriage for the purpose of what was prostitution or what was referred to as concubinage by the British was common during colonial rule. So the British would just take women, and often girls, from rural villages in India and rape them and force them to be their second wives or mistresses, and then they would discard them with children whom they never took responsibility for. So in Foucault's formulation of it, biopower appears to function through dividing people into those who must live and those who must die. Operating on the basis of a split between the living and the dead, such a power defines itself in relation to a biological field which takes control of and vests itself in. So this kind of control of life is central to the building of the nation state, and religious violence against ethnic minorities, specifically women and children over generations, is common. So in India, the building of a Hindu nation state as a response to these histories, so 70 years, I guess now almost 80 years after colonial rule, India is not under Christian or Catholic rule anymore. There are parts of India that were controlled by the Portuguese. There's a part of India called Pondicherry that is very French and Catholic, and there's really nice like French architecture. This Goa was controlled by the Portuguese, and there are beautiful churches. And so over the years, there all of these really nice architectural monuments still exist, but India has increasingly become aggressively Hindu. So as a response to being forcibly Christianized, people in India have now become proud to be Hindu. The problem is that there has been extreme violence against Jewish Indians and Muslims en masse, including trying to steal people's homes, trying to force women who are ethnically Muslim out of the school system by arguing that they cannot wear religious dress. In some cases, there's been extreme violence against couples. So Hindu and Muslim couples or Jewish and Hindu couples. And there have been a lot of killing of young men specifically who are not Hindu. So this has all been really terrifying. And I would argue that this kind of colonial imposition of religion has led to aggressive nationalism throughout the world. And in the case of indigenous peoples, the suicide of indigenous peoples also exists alongside militant forms of activism that have involved killing of police. So this control presupposes the distribution of human species into groups, the subdivision of the population into subgroups, and the establishment of a biological caesura between the ones and the others. This is what Foucault labels with the at first sight familiar term, racism. So the racism of settler colonialism cannot obviously be ignored, because it has led to crises that have gained international attention, and Canada has been subject to sanctions from the United Nations, meaning the United Nations will start to impose fines against Canada, and the Canadian economy could experience great losses if these issues of systemic discrimination, specifically cases of molestation and abuse of Indigenous peoples, which has led to suicide, are not addressed and are actually taken seriously. Referring to both this ever-presence and the phantom-like world of race in general, Hannah Arendt, who is a German Jewish intellectual, locates their roots in the shattering experience of otherness and suggests that the politics of race is ultimately linked to death. Indeed, in Foucault's terms, racism is above all a technology aimed at permitting the exercise of biopower, that old sovereign right of death. So in order to expand economically, race is introduced as a category of life and death. So there are categories of persons who can be, say, forced to be concubines or sex slaves for married Christian families. There are categories of persons that can be forced to do labor. There are even categories of children that don't have parents and can be molested and then killed, again, for the purposes of perversion. And so this introduction of the language of race allows certain people's lives to appear to be quite spotless, while other people are killed. In the economy of biopower, the function of racism is to regulate the distribution of death and to make possible the murderous functions of the state. It is, he says, the condition for the acceptability of putting to death. So discussing racism itself reveals the state to be corrupt, and it reveals often institutions like the church or the temple or the mosque to obviously be corrupt. And it is why any discussion of racism really bothers people in any country, because no one really wants to think of themselves as having a kind of great life because of the kind of killing of minorities or the casualization of the life of minorities. And I guess in many ways one could argue that we don't necessarily directly benefit from, say, the killing of others. But if we think about it from an economic perspective, the lack of financial compensation and the lack of serious institutional address is how the economy works. So expanding golf courses over land, ignoring suicide crises, and not offering adequate financial compensation to those who have suffered from slavery or colonial rule is how we keep going ahead as capitalists. So Foucault is also interested as well in fascism, as is Achille Mbembe. According to Foucault, the Nazi state was the most complete example of a state exercising the right to kill. This state, he claims, made the management, protection, and cultivation of life coextensive with the sovereign right to kill. By biological extrapolation on the theme of the political enemy in organizing the war against its adversaries and at the same time exposing its own citizens to war, the Nazi state is seen as having opened the way for a formidable consolidation of the right to kill, which culminated in the project of the final solution. In doing so, it became the archetype of a power formation that combined the characteristics of the racist state, the murderous state, and the suicidal state. So, trying to get people to kill themselves is an active part of sovereignty. Every effort to try to create a kind of ethnic majority that retains the most wealth and the most privilege and the most kind of glamorous or happy or celebrated lives often produces suicidal minorities. And this is true in Canada, and it was also true for the Nazis. So Memembe is really kind of a very strong philosopher in the sense that Achille Memembe is really interested in asking us to be critical of nationalism and critical of the ways that the promotion of this kind of patriotism will always lead to the casualization of the lives of certain ethnic minorities. And as an African scholar in a lot of Memembe's writings, Achille Memembe has been really interested in the ways that ethnic cleansing has worked and continues to work in African countries. So Memembe writes, it has been argued the complete conflation of war and politics, of racism, homicide, and suicide, until they are indistinguishable from one another, is unique to the Nazi state. The perception of the existence of the other as an attempt on my life, as a mortal threat or absolute danger whose biophysical elimination would strengthen my potential to security, to life and security. This, I suggest, is one of the many imaginaries of sovereignty characteristic of both early and late modernity itself. So this categorizing of people into different ethnic groups or religious groups that are at odds with each other is a central part of sovereignty, and it's a central part of how an ethnic might how one say group declares itself to be a majority and then declares itself to be most likely to run or govern a country. And we can see how this kind of anxiety about who should run a country is still with us in contemporary politics. So the entire US election and all of the kind of anxieties about race are really about this kind of sovereign power and this way that sovereignty will always kind of, for Memembe, produce this anxiety about who has control over others. Recognition of this perception to a large extent underpins most traditional critiques of modernity, whether they are dealing with nihilism and its proclamation of the will for power as the essence of the being, with reification understood as the becoming object of the human being, or the subordination of everything to impersonal logic and to the reign of calculability and instrumental rationality. So Memembe is interested in our relationship to ourselves. How do we become people? How do we become human? And is our humanity dependent on our relationship to an ethnic majority that can kill ethnic minorities in service of our well-being? And it is a moral question about being a settler. As settlers, are we constantly kind of trying to barter with the colonial state for more land, for more wealth, at the expense of the lives of Indigenous people? Is our mental health and well-being connected to the suicide of people in the most rural parts of Canada who are often economically at a disadvantage, while people who live as settlers in cities like Toronto have a very high quality of living and also access to mental health services? Even as people, the fact that we see ourselves as good people and have high self-esteem, is this connected to the poor self-esteem of those who are more likely to kill themselves in places like Atawapiskat? And this could also be even of our sense of kind of esteem that comes from speaking in this language, the English language, and participating in this kind of modern capitalist economy. Is this sense that it is good to speak English or to wear certain clothes or to participate in modernity? Is all of this kind of glorification of ourselves as settlers connected to these people's deaths or suicides? And for Membe, the answer is yes. And it is the reason that he would argue that all forms of investment in certain ways of life will always produce this necropolitics, which means that we are also ignoring the ways that people die. And the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report argues that cultural genocide, the refusal to understand the importance of linguistic diversity, and the kind of celebration of settler capitalist modernity is a form of cultural genocide that supports poor self-esteem among Indigenous peoples. There are also lots of questions about post-colonialism. When you have actually actively hurt a group of people using child sexual abuse as a tool of violence against them, using priests or religious authorities who committed acts of extreme violence, then how do you repair the damage that has been done? And this is a question that exists throughout the world in formerly colonized countries as well as among settler countries and countries where there have been acts of extreme violence against Indigenous peoples. So I'll finish there in the interest of time. I'll finish actually there in the interest of time, and when we meet again on Thursday, I will discuss colonial occupation and Achille Mbembe's writings about colonialism specifically. And I think it is interesting to think about Mbembe's work regarding African states in relation to Indigenous politics, because Mbembe is really interested in whether or not we can ever build modern states without oppressing colonized people or without oppressing or without seizing on certain resources for capitalist interests. Does anyone have any questions about the reading or the lecture or the test? I think it's interesting. I'll discuss the suicides and mental health more as we go on, because I do think it's a serious issue, and it is really a question of ethics and morals. Like, what can we as a society do to prevent people from harming themselves, but also what can be done from a moral or ethical perspective, and even from a practical perspective when over generations colonialism has done so much harm to people's mental health. Are there any questions? Oh, I will check and respond today. You're welcome. I think the questions about suicide are really important, and I think they're very practical questions. There are lots of other discussions, like Joyce Green's work is really interesting from a philosophical perspective because Dr. Green's work is draws upon post-colonial feminist theorists to discuss the relationship between, say, gender and colonialism in detail. But these practical questions of suicide, I think, are really important because in 2016 there were a, a large number of suicides to the point that Canada received international attention because of youth suicide specifically and among young Indigenous peoples. So I will discuss these issues in future lectures, specifically in relation to the law and in relation to institutions and also harm reduction. Are there any questions? Okay, I'll end the lecture there for this class, and we'll meet again on Thursday. And I will have your tests marked by Friday. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you for your participation in class. Bye. Thank you.